The shrew was finally losing what little dignity she had left. Ashley laughed, and Margaret Collins heard every word as clearly as if it had been spoken directly into her ear. She stood at the top of the narrow hallway, one hand resting on the smooth wooden banister, the other instinctively touching the soft cotton scarf that covered her head, a habit she had developed in recent weeks, ever since the hairbrush had started coming away heavier each morning and the mirror had begun to feel like an uninvited witness. Margaret was 68 years old, a widow, a mother, and until recently, a woman who believed that patience and kindness could outlast almost anything. But in that moment, frozen between the guest room and the stairs, she understood something had shifted. Ashley's voice floated up from the kitchen below, bright and careless, surrounded by the chiming laughter of friends who had come over for coffee. People who had never once asked how Margaret was feeling or why she wore scarves indoors now. People who only knew her as the quiet older woman who stayed upstairs when company arrived. Margaret did not move. She did not cough or clear her throat. She did not announce herself. She simply listened, because listening had always been her strength. She listened as Ashley joked about how sad Margaret looked lately, about how illness aged people overnight, about how some women should know when to fade into the background. And although the words themselves were sharp, it was the ease with which they were delivered that cut the deepest. This was not anger. This was comfort. This was cruelty that felt at home. Margaret remembered the first time she noticed the thinning at her temples, how she had brushed it off as stress, as age, as something temporary, how she had told herself that appearances did not matter anymore, that she had lived long enough to be beyond such vanities. Yet standing there now, she realized it had never been about vanity at all. It had been about dignity, about being seen as human. Below her, mugs clinked against saucers, someone laughed too loudly, and Ashley's voice rose again, describing Margaret as if she were an object slowly being cleared out of a room, something outdated, something inconvenient. Margaret thought of the medical appointments she attended alone, the waiting rooms that smelled faintly of disinfectant, the way she had measured her days in small victories like walking a quarter-mile without stopping or cooking a full dinner without needing to sit down halfway through. She thought of how she had never once asked Ashley for sympathy, never complained, never demanded special treatment, believing that quiet endurance was the most graceful response to hardship. She had raised her son, Daniel, to believe the same. Downstairs, someone asked if Daniel knew how bad his mother looked lately, and Ashley's response came too quickly, too smoothly, as if rehearsed. Margaret felt something settle in her chest then, not pain exactly, but clarity. She understood that what was happening was not a misunderstanding or a momentary lapse in kindness. It was a pattern she had been too generous to name. She remembered Ashley's polite smiles at family dinners, the way financial conversations always drifted toward what was practical for the future, the subtle impatience whenever Margaret moved too slowly or asked too many questions. All of it rearranged itself now, lining up with a precision that left no room for denial. Margaret took a slow breath, steadying herself, aware of the quiet hum of the house, the ticking clock on the wall, the distant sound of traffic outside, ordinary sounds that grounded her in the present. She did not cry. She did not feel the urge to confront or correct. Instead, she felt an unexpected calm, the kind that arrives only after something has been decided without words. Ashley's laughter drifted up once more, ending in the unfinished phrase that had stopped Margaret cold, the insult trailing off as if it were too obvious to complete, and Margaret understood that the sentence did not need an ending to be complete. She turned away from the stairs, her footsteps careful, deliberate, as she returned to her room, closing the door softly behind her. Inside, she sat at the edge of the bed, folded her scarf neatly in her hands, and stared at the sunlight spilling across the floor, realizing that this moment, this overheard cruelty, was not the beginning of her humiliation, but the end of her innocence. After she closed the bedroom door, Margaret Collins remained seated on the edge of the bed long after the sounds of laughter downstairs blurred into background noise, and the house returned to its familiar rhythm of quiet afternoons. She did not replay the words she had overheard, because they no longer needed repetition to stay alive in her mind. Instead, she focused on the ordinary details of the room, the framed photograph of her late husband on the dresser, the faint scent of laundry detergent on the sheets, the small digital clock glowing 3:17 in soft blue numbers. For years, this room had been a place of rest, a space where she could lower her guard, but now it felt like a temporary shelter rather than a permanent refuge. Margaret rose slowly and crossed to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to watch the front yard, where the oak tree cast long shadows across the grass. She remembered planting it decades earlier with her husband, measuring its growth in inches and seasons, believing that patience always paid off if one waited long enough. That belief had guided her through marriage, motherhood, and loss, and it had shaped the way she endured illness without complaint. Yet she understood now that patience could become a liability when it was mistaken for weakness. Later that evening, after Ashley's friends had left and the house settled into silence, Margaret descended the stairs to prepare dinner, moving carefully, her steps measured, her posture composed. Ashley greeted her with the same polite smile she always wore, the kind that carried no warmth but no obvious hostility either, and Margaret returned it without hesitation. They spoke briefly about groceries and the weather, about a neighbor who had moved away, about nothing that mattered, and Daniel joined them with his phone still in his hand, distracted, affectionate in a distant way, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge the shift that had already occurred. Margaret watched her son closely that night, noting how easily he avoided her eyes when Ashley spoke, how quickly he deferred, how silence had become his chosen form of loyalty. She served dinner, ate quietly, and excused herself early, citing fatigue, a word that had become both explanation and shield. Upstairs, she lay awake for hours, listening to the muffled sounds of the television below, thinking not of the insult itself, but of the environment that allowed it to exist. Over the following days, Margaret's routine remained outwardly unchanged. She attended appointments, folded laundry, watered the plants, and answered polite questions about her health with practiced reassurance. Yet internally, something fundamental had shifted. She began to observe rather than participate, to note patterns she had previously dismissed. Ashley's impatience surfaced most clearly when finances were discussed, when bills arrived or repairs were needed, when conversations drifted toward future plans that did not include Margaret's presence. Daniel, meanwhile, remained kind but absent, offering support in words while allowing decisions to be made without her input. Margaret did not confront either of them. She did not correct assumptions or defend herself against jokes she could no longer hear directly. Instead, she reviewed old documents one afternoon, pulling a folder from the back of a drawer, reading slowly, carefully, her finger tracing lines she had signed years earlier without a second thought. Numbers, names, and dates took on new significance, and she realized how much control she had quietly retained without ever needing to assert it. This realization did not bring her satisfaction or anger, only a sense of preparedness she had not felt in a long time. One morning, as she tied her scarf in the mirror, Margaret noticed how steady her hands had become. The reflection looking back at her appeared older, yes, but also clearer, stripped of illusions she no longer needed. She understood that illness had taken something visible from her, something Ashley had chosen to mock, but it had also removed a layer of denial that had protected others more than it had protected her. From that day forward, Margaret spoke less and listened more, offering fewer explanations and fewer compromises. When Ashley suggested changes to household arrangements, Margaret nodded and said she would think about it. When Daniel asked if she needed anything, she smiled and said no. These small shifts went largely unnoticed, dismissed as fatigue or adjustment, but for Margaret, they marked the beginning of a quiet withdrawal from roles she had outgrown. She was no longer interested in being understood by those who had already decided who she was. Instead, she focused on clarity, on timing, on the certainty that dignity, once reclaimed, did not need to be defended aloud. In the weeks that followed, Margaret Collins learned the value of being underestimated, because it allowed her to move through the house like a shadow, present but unchallenged, noticed only when something was needed. Ashley's tone toward her softened in public and sharpened in private, a contrast Margaret registered without reacting to, as though she were studying a familiar pattern. Rather than experiencing a personal slight, Daniel's schedule grew busier, or at least that was how it appeared, and conversations became brief exchanges about errands and appointments, practical matters that required no emotional investment. Margaret adjusted easily to this distance, finding a strange relief in no longer being expected to bridge gaps that others were content to widen. She spent more time alone, walking short loops around the neighborhood in the early mornings when the air was still cool and the streets were quiet, measuring her strength in half miles rather than miles now, accepting the limitations of her body without resentment. During these walks, she replayed moments from the past several years, not with regret, but with a careful attention she had not applied before, noticing how often Ashley's kindness had coincided with requests, how frequently decisions had been presented as settled facts rather than discussions. One afternoon, Margaret overheard another conversation by chance, this time not laced with mockery, but with planning. Ashley speaking on the phone in the living room, her voice low and efficient, discussing timelines, space, and what would be best for everyone involved. Margaret remained in the kitchen, rinsing dishes slowly, listening to phrases like downsizing and future arrangements, words that sounded reasonable until one considered who was absent from the conversation. That was when Margaret understood that what she had overheard weeks earlier had not been a single lapse in character, but an early glimpse into a mindset that had already made its calculations. Later that evening, Margaret asked Daniel a simple question about upcoming plans for the house, phrasing it casually, without accusation. He hesitated before answering, offering vague reassurances, and the hesitation told her more than the words themselves. She did not press him. She had learned that clarity did not always come from confrontation, but from patience paired with awareness. That night, she retrieved a small notebook from her dresser drawer and began to write, not a diary of feelings, but a list of observations, dates, and conversations, grounding herself in facts rather than assumptions. She noted when bills were discussed without her presence, when decisions were framed as conveniences, when her health was mentioned as a limitation rather than a circumstance. The act of writing steadied her, giving form to thoughts she had previously allowed to drift away unexamined. Over time, Margaret's behavior shifted subtly. She asked fewer questions and offered fewer opinions, responding with polite neutrality when Ashley spoke of plans that seemed to place Margaret at the margins of her own life. This neutrality unsettled Ashley more than any argument might have, though she could not have explained why. Daniel, meanwhile, sensed the change but misinterpreted it as acceptance, a misunderstanding that allowed him to remain comfortable in his indecision. Margaret allowed this misinterpretation to stand. She had learned that people revealed their priorities most clearly when they believed they were unobserved or unchallenged. One morning, as Margaret organized old paperwork at the dining table, Ashley paused to glance at the stacks of documents, curiosity flickering across her face before being replaced by indifference. Margaret met her gaze calmly and returned to her work without explanation. That moment lingered longer than Ashley expected, planting a quiet uncertainty she could not name. Margaret continued her routine with care, attending appointments, maintaining her independence, and responding to offers of help with gratitude but not dependence. She understood now that strength did not always announce itself through action, but often through restraint. The illness that had taken her hair had also stripped away her illusions, leaving behind a sharper awareness of her position within the family she had once believed was built on mutual respect. She did not dwell on resentment or seek validation. Instead, she focused on preparation, recognizing that the true turning point was not the insult she had overheard, but the moment she stopped needing the people around her to acknowledge her worth. In that quiet recognition, Margaret felt something she had not felt in a long time, not anger or sadness, but resolve, steady and unyielding, waiting for the right moment to assert itself. As autumn settled in, Margaret Collins found herself revisiting memories she had not examined in years, not out of nostalgia but necessity, as though her mind were quietly auditing the past for context it had once ignored. She remembered the early days after her husband passed, how Daniel had leaned on her then, unsure of himself, grateful for guidance, and how Ashley had appeared soon after with an ease that felt refreshing at the time, offering help, offering smiles, presenting herself as someone who understood modern life better than Margaret ever could. Back then, Margaret had welcomed her without hesitation, believing that love expanded when shared, not diminished, and she recalled the many small ways she had tried to make space for Ashley, adjusting traditions, offering financial help when asked, stepping back when advised it was better for the younger generation to decide things on their own. Those choices, once framed as generosity, now appeared in a different light, not mistakes, but investments made without oversight. As Margaret sorted through old photographs one afternoon, she noticed how often she appeared just outside the center of the frame in more recent years, present but peripheral, smiling politely while others stood closer together. She remembered holidays when Ashley had taken charge of arrangements, suggesting changes that sounded reasonable but gradually displaced Margaret from roles she once held naturally. At the time, Margaret had told herself that families evolved, that relevance shifted with age, but now she understood that evolution did not require erasure. The realization did not bring bitterness, only a sober clarity that sharpened her attention to present behavior. She observed how Ashley spoke about the future as if Margaret were a temporary variable, how illness was discussed in terms of inconvenience rather than compassion, how phrases like quality of life and best options were deployed selectively. Daniel, caught between habit and obligation, continued to reassure without committing, his loyalty divided by comfort and avoidance. Margaret did not resent him for this, but she did acknowledge it, recognizing that his silence was not neutral but consequential. One evening, as they sat together after dinner, Ashley mentioned the possibility of making the house easier to manage, speaking gently, almost kindly, suggesting that fewer stairs and less maintenance would be better for everyone. Margaret listened, nodding slowly, and replied that she appreciated the concern. She did not mention that she had already considered such changes years earlier, on her own terms, or that she was fully capable of deciding when and how to make them. Ashley smiled, satisfied, mistaking compliance for agreement, and Margaret allowed the misunderstanding to remain. In private moments, Margaret continued her careful preparation, organizing documents, reviewing accounts, ensuring that what was hers remained clearly defined. She did not rush. She understood that timing mattered more than speed, and that acting too soon would only alert those who believed they already knew the outcome. The illness that had weakened her body had, paradoxically, strengthened her discernment, leaving her less inclined to explain herself and more committed to preserving her autonomy. She paid attention to how often Ashley framed decisions as favors, how often help was offered with conditions attached, and how rarely gratitude flowed in both directions. These observations accumulated quietly, forming a foundation of certainty that did not waver with mood or circumstance. Margaret no longer sought reassurance from conversations or validation from smiles. She trusted what she saw and heard, and she trusted her ability to respond when the moment arrived. On a cool morning, as she stood at the kitchen window watching leaves fall into neat piles along the curb, Margaret felt an unexpected sense of steadiness. The world outside continued in its predictable rhythm, seasons turning regardless of personal upheaval, and she found comfort in that continuity. She understood now that the loss she had experienced was not limited to health or hair, or even respect, but extended to illusions she no longer needed. What remained was something quieter and more durable, an internal balance grounded in awareness rather than hope. Margaret adjusted her scarf, straightened her posture, and moved through the day with a calm that did not draw attention but did not invite dismissal either. She had stopped waiting to be treated with dignity and started ensuring it for herself, and that shift, though invisible to others, marked a point of no return. By the time winter approached, Margaret Collins had refined her awareness into something almost instinctive, noticing shifts in tone and timing the way others noticed changes in weather. Ashley grew increasingly confident, speaking more openly about adjustments and possibilities, often framing them as thoughtful solutions rather than preferences. Margaret listened with the same calm attentiveness she applied to everything now, responding with measured gratitude that revealed nothing of her internal calculations. Daniel remained cordial and busy, his affection expressed through small gestures rather than decisions, and Margaret accepted this without protest, understanding that his comfort depended on believing everything was under control. One afternoon, a letter arrived addressed to Margaret, its official seal immediately catching her attention. She opened it slowly, reading the contents twice, then a third time, absorbing the language and implications without alarm. It confirmed what she already suspected, that certain conversations had progressed further than she had been included in, that assumptions had been made quietly, confidently, and without her consent. Margaret folded the letter neatly and placed it in her notebook, adding a date and a brief note. Not out of fear, but documentation. She understood now that clarity was cumulative, built through small confirmations rather than dramatic revelations. Over the next several days, she observed Ashley's behavior with renewed focus, noting how often suggestions were framed as inevitabilities, how phrases like "everyone agrees" and "it makes sense" were used to close discussions before they began. Margaret responded with gentle neutrality, neither agreeing nor disagreeing, allowing Ashley to believe momentum was on her side. This belief proved useful. It encouraged further openness, further assumptions, and a degree of carelessness that Margaret recognized as opportunity. One evening, as they shared a quiet dinner, Ashley mentioned timelines again, speaking casually about the coming months, outlining plans with a confidence that assumed Margaret's passive acceptance. Margaret smiled politely and said she would need some time to consider everything, her voice steady, her expression unreadable. Ashley nodded, satisfied, mistaking patience for delay rather than deliberation. Later that night, Margaret returned to her room and reviewed her notes, her handwriting precise and controlled. She was not planning confrontation. She was planning alignment, ensuring that her actions would match her intentions when the moment arrived. The illness that had once made her feel exposed now served as a convenient explanation for her reserve, a shield that allowed her to move quietly, without scrutiny. Friends who called were reassured with calm updates. Medical professionals were thanked and trusted, and no one questioned her competence or independence because she gave them no reason to. Margaret scheduled a meeting for herself one morning, informing Daniel only that she had an appointment and would be out for a few hours. He nodded distractedly, trusting her routine as he always had. The meeting itself was uneventful, thorough, and reassuring, confirming that the foundations Margaret had laid years earlier remained intact and entirely within her control. She left with a sense of certainty that did not require immediate action. Instead, it required patience, something she had mastered long ago. When she returned home, Ashley greeted her with polite curiosity, asking how the appointment went. Margaret replied that it had been productive and thanked Ashley for asking, her tone warm but non-committal. Ashley seemed satisfied, already turning her attention to something else, and Margaret noted the ease with which concern could be expressed without curiosity. Days passed, and the household settled into a rhythm that felt deceptively calm. Ashley continued to make plans, Daniel continued to avoid conflict, and Margaret continued to prepare quietly, her demeanor unchanged, her intentions firm. She no longer felt the need to be seen or understood. She understood herself, and that was enough. One evening, as she prepared tea in the kitchen, Margaret caught her reflection in the window, the scarf framing her face, her posture relaxed but assured. She did not recognize the woman she had been months earlier, the one who believed endurance alone was virtue enough. This version of herself was still gentle, still patient, but no longer willing to be directed by assumptions made in her absence. She carried her tea upstairs, settled into her chair, and opened her notebook once more, reviewing the timeline she had assembled. It did not read like a grievance. It read like a plan, quiet, deliberate, and entirely her own. As the new year began, Margaret Collins noticed how easily routines could disguise intentions, and she used that knowledge to her advantage, allowing days to pass without disruption while her awareness sharpened further. Ashley became increasingly vocal about what she framed as practical next steps, speaking with a confidence that assumed consent had already been given. Margaret responded with courteous acknowledgement, never contradicting, never confirming, her calm presence encouraging Ashley to speak freely. Daniel remained a familiar constant, affectionate in small ways, detached in larger matters, his reliance on harmony outweighing his willingness to question it. Margaret did not challenge him, understanding that pressure would only drive him deeper into avoidance. Instead, she paid attention to timing, noticing when conversations occurred without her, when decisions were referenced after the fact, and when concern for her well-being was used as justification rather than motivation. One afternoon, as Margaret organized mail at the dining table, Ashley mentioned an upcoming visit from someone she described vaguely as a consultant, implying it would be helpful for everyone. Margaret looked up briefly, thanked her for letting her know, and returned to sorting envelopes. Her response measured and unremarkable. Ashley continued speaking, outlining benefits and efficiencies, and Margaret listened without interruption, her silence inviting further explanation. By the end of the conversation, Ashley had revealed more than she intended, assuming that Margaret's composure signaled acquiescence. Later that evening, Margaret reviewed her notes again, cross-referencing dates and remarks, finding consistency where she had once given the benefit of doubt. She understood now that the situation required neither confrontation nor retreat, but precision. Over the next several weeks, Margaret made small adjustments that went unnoticed, updating records, consolidating information, and ensuring that her preferences were clearly documented where they mattered most. She did not announce these actions, nor did she seek approval. Her independence had always existed, but now it was reinforced by intention. When Daniel asked if she was feeling well enough to handle things on her own, Margaret smiled gently and assured him she was, her tone conveying confidence without defiance. He accepted her answer readily, relieved by the absence of conflict. Ashley, meanwhile, grew more comfortable, interpreting Margaret's restraint as compliance. She spoke openly about future arrangements in Margaret's presence, using inclusive language that excluded Margaret's authority, a contradiction Margaret noted without comment. The illness that had once made her feel visible in the wrong ways now served as a convenient explanation for her reserve, allowing others to underestimate her engagement. Margaret attended her appointments, maintained her health as best she could, and continued her walks, measuring progress in steady steps rather than dramatic milestones. During these walks, she reflected not on revenge or vindication, but on balance, recognizing that her goal was not to punish, but to restore equilibrium to a situation that had quietly tipped against her. One evening, as they sat together after dinner, Ashley spoke confidently about timelines again, mentioning how things would be easier once adjustments were made. Margaret listened attentively, then said she appreciated the thoughtfulness behind the ideas and would take everything into consideration. Ashley smiled, satisfied, believing momentum was firmly on her side. Daniel nodded, grateful for the calm exchange. Margaret excused herself early, citing tiredness, and returned to her room, where she reviewed her preparations one final time. She felt no urgency, no anxiety, only a steady assurance that she was ready when the moment came. The realization that others had underestimated her no longer felt like an insult, but an advantage. She had learned that power often moved quietly, disguised as patience, and that dignity did not need to announce itself to be effective. As she turned off the lamp and settled into bed, Margaret felt a sense of control she had not experienced in months, not because circumstances had improved, but because she had stopped allowing others to define her place within them. Whatever came next, she would meet it. On her terms, calmly, deliberately, and without the need to explain herself to anyone. By early spring, the balance within the house had shifted so subtly that only Margaret Collins seemed to notice, though the effects were beginning to surface in small, telling ways. Ashley's confidence started to show faint cracks, not in her words but in her timing, her questions coming more frequently, her reassurances growing less certain. Margaret recognized this as the natural consequence of assumptions going unchallenged for too long. She continued her routine without deviation, waking early, preparing her own breakfast, and reading quietly while the house was still. The calm she carried was not performative but settled, the kind that did not invite probing. Daniel remained immersed in his work, grateful for the absence of conflict, interpreting the household's quiet as stability rather than strategy. Margaret did not correct him. She had learned that people protected their comfort fiercely and that truth delivered too soon was often dismissed. One afternoon, Ashley approached Margaret with an air of careful friendliness, mentioning again how thoughtful it might be to plan ahead, framing her concern as shared responsibility. Margaret listened attentively, her expression open but reserved, and thanked her for being considerate. She added that she had already taken steps to ensure everything important was organized. Ashley paused, surprised by this revelation, and asked what Margaret meant. Margaret smiled, and replied simply that it was nothing to worry about, just personal matters she preferred to keep in order. The response was polite, even warm, but it unsettled Ashley in a way Margaret could sense. From that point on, Ashley began watching Margaret more closely, searching for signs of frailty or confusion that did not appear. Margaret's composure remained consistent, her responses measured, her movements deliberate. She continued to attend appointments independently, manage her affairs, and decline unnecessary assistance with gentle firmness. Each refusal reinforced her autonomy, contradicting the narrative Ashley had been building quietly for months. Daniel noticed these exchanges only in passing, registering the tone but not the implications, and Margaret allowed his misinterpretation to stand. She had accepted that his role was not to intervene but to witness, eventually. As the days lengthened, Margaret reduced her presence in shared spaces, not out of withdrawal but efficiency, spending time where she was least likely to be interrupted. She reviewed her notes periodically, confirming details, aligning timelines, and ensuring nothing had been overlooked. There was no urgency in her actions, only readiness. One morning, as she prepared tea, Ashley asked casually whether Margaret had thought more about future arrangements. Margaret met her gaze calmly and said she had considered many things and felt comfortable with where she stood. The ambiguity of the statement left Ashley uncertain, and she pressed gently for clarification. Margaret replied that she believed clarity would come naturally when the time was right. Ashley laughed lightly, attempting to regain ease, but the moment lingered longer than either of them expected. Later that evening, Daniel mentioned in passing that Ashley seemed concerned about Margaret's plans, asking whether everything was all right. Margaret reassured him with a gentle smile, telling him there was nothing to worry about and that she appreciated their concern. Daniel accepted this readily, relieved by the absence of tension. Margaret understood then how thoroughly her calm had become disarming. The people around her no longer questioned her authority because she did not assert it loudly. She embodied it quietly. As weeks passed, Ashley's certainty continued to erode, replaced by subtle frustration masked as concern. Margaret observed this with detached interest, recognizing that the shift signaled a reversal of leverage. She had not argued, accused, or demanded respect. She had simply stopped accommodating assumptions that diminished her. One afternoon, as Margaret walked through the living room, Ashley fell silent mid-sentence, watching her pass with a look that combined curiosity and unease. Margaret acknowledged her with a polite nod and continued on, unhurried. That moment confirmed what Margaret already knew. The dynamic had changed. She no longer occupied the margins of decisions made about her life. She had repositioned herself without announcement, reclaiming space through presence rather than confrontation. That evening, as Margaret settled into her chair with a book, she felt a quiet satisfaction, not because she anticipated triumph, but because she recognized alignment between her intentions and her actions. The house remained calm, the conversations polite, but beneath the surface, control had shifted decisively. Margaret did not need acknowledgement to validate this change. She trusted the process she had set in motion and understood that the most effective transformations were often invisible until they were irreversible. As summer approached, the atmosphere in the house grew quietly tense, not with arguments or raised voices, but with the kind of uncertainty that settled in when expectations were no longer shared. Margaret Collins moved through her days with the same steady composure, yet the people around her sensed that something fundamental had shifted, even if they could not articulate what it was. Ashley began asking questions that sounded casual but carried urgency beneath them. Inquiries about paperwork, about schedules, about whether Margaret had spoken to anyone recently regarding future plans. Margaret answered each question politely and briefly, offering reassurance without information, a balance she maintained with practiced ease. Daniel noticed Ashley's restlessness more than Margaret's calm, attributing it to stress rather than recognizing it as the loss of assumed control. Margaret did not intervene. She understood that confusion often preceded clarity and that allowing discomfort to surface was sometimes necessary. One afternoon, Margaret received a phone call that confirmed what she had already prepared for, the final piece aligning smoothly with the others she had assembled over months of quiet attention. She listened carefully, asked a few precise questions, and thanked the caller before ending the conversation. There was no visible reaction, no outward sign of significance, yet internally, Margaret felt a sense of completion settle into place. Later that day, Ashley mentioned in passing that she had been thinking about setting a date to discuss next steps as a family, her tone suggestive rather than direct. Margaret looked up from her book and replied that discussions were always helpful when everyone involved was properly informed. The statement was neutral, even encouraging, but it landed differently than Ashley expected. She hesitated, then smiled, agreeing quickly, though her expression betrayed uncertainty. Daniel, overhearing the exchange, suggested they talk soon, eager to maintain harmony. Margaret nodded, her agreement genuine but unhurried. She did not rush toward resolution. She had learned that readiness mattered more than timing. Over the following days, Margaret noticed Ashley's behavior become more controlled, her comments more carefully phrased, as though she were attempting to regain footing on ground that no longer felt stable. Margaret observed this without satisfaction or resentment. She did not need to feel victorious. She needed to remain clear. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Ashley spoke about changes as possibilities rather than plans. Her language softened, her confidence tempered. Margaret listened attentively, acknowledging the effort without offering direction. Daniel remained hopeful that consensus would emerge naturally, unaware that the framework had already been established elsewhere. Margaret allowed him this belief. She understood that the truth would become apparent soon enough without her needing to announce it. In private moments, Margaret reviewed her preparations one last time, not because she doubted them, but because thoroughness had always been her habit. She took comfort in the knowledge that her affairs were in order, her preferences documented, and her autonomy protected. The illness that had once made her feel exposed had inadvertently given her the space to reassess and realign, stripping away assumptions that no longer served her. One afternoon, Ashley approached Margaret with a carefully measured tone, asking directly whether Margaret intended to remain in the house long term. Margaret met her gaze calmly and replied that she intended to do exactly what was right for her. The simplicity of the answer offered no reassurance and no confrontation, leaving Ashley momentarily unsettled. Daniel entered the room mid-conversation, sensing tension but misunderstanding its source, and attempted to lighten the mood. Margaret thanked him and changed the subject effortlessly, demonstrating once again her ability to guide interactions without dominating them. As the days passed, it became clear that the narrative Ashley had relied upon was no longer sufficient. Assumptions required confirmation, and confirmation was not forthcoming. Margaret's silence was not avoidance but strategy, a deliberate choice to let others adjust to a reality she had already accepted. She did not feel the need to explain herself or justify her decisions. She trusted the groundwork she had laid and the clarity she had achieved. On a warm evening, as Margaret sat by the open window listening to the sounds of the neighborhood settling into night, she reflected briefly on the path that had led her here. There was no bitterness in the reflection, only understanding. She recognized that dignity reclaimed quietly often lasted longer than dignity defended loudly. Whatever conversations lay ahead, Margaret knew she would enter them from a position of certainty, not reaction. The balance had shifted fully now, not through force or confrontation, but through patience, awareness, and the refusal to be diminished by assumptions made in her absence. The conversation finally took place on a quiet afternoon when the house felt suspended between seasons, the air warm but restrained, as if aware that something definitive was about to be acknowledged. Margaret Collins sat at the dining table with her hands folded loosely, her posture relaxed, her expression composed, while Ashley and Daniel took their seats across from her, both carrying different expectations into the room. Ashley began speaking first, her tone careful, outlining concerns and considerations, emphasizing what she described as practicality and foresight, framing each point as a shared responsibility rather than a personal agenda. Margaret listened attentively without interruption, allowing the words to settle fully before responding. When Ashley finished, Daniel looked to his mother, anticipating reassurance, perhaps agreement. Margaret met his gaze calmly and thanked Ashley for her concern, acknowledging the effort behind the conversation. Then, without raising her voice or shifting her tone, she explained that her plans were already settled and that the necessary arrangements had been made some time ago. The statement was neither defensive nor triumphant. It was factual. Ashley's expression tightened subtly as she asked what arrangements Margaret meant, her composure wavering for the first time. Margaret replied that everything concerning her future had been handled according to her wishes, and that the documentation reflected that clearly. Daniel frowned slightly, confused, asking why he had not known about this sooner. Margaret smiled gently and told him that there had been no urgency, and therefore no need to involve anyone else. The simplicity of the explanation left no room for argument. Ashley pressed again, her questions more direct now, but Margaret answered each one with the same steady clarity, offering information without concession. It became evident that the assumptions guiding Ashley's confidence had been misplaced, built on silence rather than consent. Daniel sat back, absorbing the shift, realizing belatedly that his mother's quiet acceptance had never been permission. The room remained calm, but the balance within it had changed irreversibly. Margaret did not outline consequences or draw boundaries explicitly. She did not need to. Her certainty spoke for itself. Ashley fell quiet, her earlier assurance replaced by calculation, then by restraint. Margaret concluded the conversation by expressing her hope that they could continue living together with mutual respect and understanding, emphasizing that clarity benefited everyone involved. The words were measured, inclusive, and final. Daniel nodded slowly, recognizing the authority he had underestimated. Ashley forced a smile, agreeing, though the effort showed. After the conversation ended, Margaret rose from the table and returned to her room, leaving Ashley and Daniel alone with the reality she had calmly asserted. In the days that followed, the household adjusted. Ashley's tone softened noticeably, her suggestions replaced by questions, her confidence tempered by awareness. Daniel became more attentive, listening rather than assuming, his respect deepening as he understood the quiet strength his mother had demonstrated. Margaret continued her routine unchanged, attending appointments, taking her walks, and spending time in spaces she enjoyed. She felt no need to reference the conversation again. Its impact did not depend on repetition. One morning, as she stood by the window watching sunlight move across the yard, Margaret reflected briefly on the path that had led her here. She had not sought control or validation. She had sought alignment between her values and her actions. The illness that had once exposed her vulnerability had also clarified her priorities, stripping away expectations that no longer served her. She adjusted her scarf, not out of necessity but preference, and smiled faintly at her reflection. The woman looking back at her was not diminished by age or circumstance. She was grounded, deliberate, and free from the need to be understood by those who had once mistaken her silence for surrender. Margaret moved through the day with the assurance that comes from self-trust, knowing that dignity, once reclaimed, did not require defense. It simply endured.